live on YouTube, which is better because then it stays recorded. Okay, evening everyone.
Good
Lovely
evening.
to see you. We are going to deal tonight, in the time that we have, with one of the most enigmatic topics that we have in the Torah. This week's Torah portion discusses about Moses hitting the rock. Okay, but we know that the consequence, or it seems the consequence of Moshe hitting the rock, is that the Jewish people were not allowed, that Moses was not allowed into the promised land. Not only was he not allowed into the promised land, he wasn't even allowed to be buried in the promised land. Very puzzling. No, at the end of the day, he hit a rock. Is that really the reason why he wouldn't be allowed into the promised land, even his body? You know, plenty of other people far less stature than him were buried in Israel. So let's understand it. Let's have a look at it and see if we can make head or tails of it this evening. Okay. Okay. So let's have a look. 1 second. So there is a fascinating medrash, rabbinic exegesis, that says as follows: Moshe says to God, Master of the universe, the bones of Yosef will enter the land and I will not. So Moshe is complaining to God about the fact that the bones of the bones of Joseph, the remains of Yosef will be interred in the land of Israel, and Moshe, who carried the bones, remember, would not be able to. Okay? You may recall, bear with me 1 second. David, I'm just in a share with Woodside Park. I'm in a share. I'm doing a program for Woodside Park. Okay. Okay, as you can see, I'm wanted. I'm wanted. It's good to be wanted by everyone. So anyways, so again, Moshe carries the bones, the remains of Yosef from Egypt all the way to the promised land. Okay, and eventually we know that the bones were buried in Israel. So if Moshe carried the bones of Yosef, right, Moshe is saying, why should he get buried in Israel and me not? Right? Right? So interestingly, just so you should know, does anybody know where Yosef's remains, Joseph's bones, were actually interred? Okay, this is a pub quiz question for Carol. She didn't have this in her quiz. In the city of Shechem, also known as Nablus. Yeah. Okay, now that grave site of Yosef was burned and destroyed in October 2000, in the beginning of the Second Intifada, and Rav Hillel Liebman, who actually came to protect the site, was murdered. And since that time, talking about 20 odd years, Jews have been forbidden to visit that site. They can't just go up on their own, except when there are pre-arranged, organized visits by the Jewish people, arranged by the state of Israel, when it is deemed safe. But sadly, Joseph's tomb is basically a no-go area, believe it or not. So there is an irony hinted in Moses' plea to God, right? I was the one who carried Yosef's bones for 40 years, day and night. That's what I did. And yet these bones that I carried all this way, they're going to enter into Israel while I remain behind. What was bothering Moshe? So according to the Medrash, it wasn't so much that Moshe was not going to be allowed to enter the land alive. Moshe can understand. He got that. We've mentioned this in the past, that, you know, you have to have the right leader for every generation. And Moshe recognized that the generation that left Egypt was not the same generation that have not endured subjugation, slavery, persecution. It's a different generation, and you need the right leader for the right generation. And therefore, what was really perturbing Moshe was the fact that God would not allow even his body, even the remains of Moshe, into the soil of the Holy Land. So, it's interesting. Even if we are buried, even when people die here, there are people that arrange. It's seen as meritorious for their remains to be buried afterwards in the land of Israel. In Israel, they what do they call it? They call it what do they call it? Well, there's an exhumation where I know somebody that did that. Even they exhumed the deceased. The family were basically moving to Israel, and therefore they exhumed probably a year or two after the person died, and then they had those remains flown to Israel, where they were reinterred. So, so the situation. So therefore, it's always been accepted, basically from the time of Joseph, that it was meritorious to be buried. If you can't live there, at least die there, right? So we would expect that Moshe should at least be given that consolation prize of being buried in the land of Israel after taking the Jewish people out of Egypt, marching through the wilderness for 40 years, and now, for some strange reason, he doesn't even get that, whereas Joseph, his remains, who he's carried, are going to be able to. So we have to understand that's the question and the contradiction, and we need to understand the difference between Joseph and Moshe. And when we do that, in a few minutes' time, you will have a fresh perspective as to why it is that Joseph was deserving and merited to be buried in the land of Israel, whereas Moshe was not. Let's have a look at two incidents relating to Joseph very quickly, and then hopefully that will cast light on the difference between Joseph and Moshe. So we know that Joseph was living with his father Jacob in Hebron, right? And he was sent by his father to see his brothers, and eventually he was sold by his brothers down to Egypt, right? There he was acquired by Potiphar, right? Who put him in charge of his home, and his wife, the wife of Potiphar, unsuccessfully attempted to seduce Joseph into immoral behavior. So one day when no one was home, right, she seized the opportunity and tried to grab him. He left his cloak, ran out of the house, and she screamed out to make a whole fuss, to make it clear she wanted to get back at him. Look, my husband brought us a Hebrew man, listen to the language, a Hebrew man to sport with us. He came to lie with me, but I screamed out loudly. And therefore she says, look, when he heard my scream, then he left behind his garment. Yosef was sentenced to prison for 12 years. He languished in prison, incarcerated in an Egyptian dungeon, until he was finally liberated when he interpreted the dreams, the mysterious dreams of the butler and the baker, and eventually the Pharaoh of Egypt. Okay, and as a result of that, he eventually was promoted, not just from out of prison, but he became the viceroy of Egypt. How did Potiphar's wife describe Joseph? Does anyone remember? We just said this. Audience participation. A Hebrew man. Hebrew. Okay, that's telling. He was known when he was in Egypt as a Hebrew man. Let's have a look at another incident. Okay. So Joseph, we said, he interpreted the dreams of the butler and the baker, which were in prison with him. They were incarcerated in that prison. Okay. And when Joseph is referred to in this incident, it says Joseph proclaims his connection to the Holy Land. He says, I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews. Okay. And in a dungeon, right? He was perceived as a Hebrew youth, a slave. So the first way that Joseph is described time and again, is as a Hebrew, right? So we have to understand that in those days, in Egyptian society, things haven't changed much, have they, Richard? To be a Hebrew was a badge of shame. And that may be why Potiphar's wife, trying to gain some credibility to her argument and her version of the story with Yosef, who she claimed tried to violate her, defined him first and foremost as a Hebrew man. She knew that this would help discredit him and she would be believed over him. Okay? And Joseph never denied his identity as a Hebrew, as a resident of Israel. Okay? Ivri means that you're from Israel, you're a Hebrew, okay, from the land of the Hebrews. Okay? So let's fast forward now to the other side of the coin, and I think you know where we are going, okay? And that is as follows. If we look at Moshe, okay, Moshe, right? We know he was brought up where? In Egypt, okay? And Moshe spent, after saving one Jew who was he killed the Egyptian to save the Jew, and then it was found out that it was him. Moshe spent his time, he ran to Midian, and there, right, at the well of Midian, right, he saw the Jethro's daughters, and he helped them and saved them from the shepherds, and he drew water from them. How is Moshe described there? And this is telling. Friends, you know how he's described? As an Egyptian man. The Egyptian man was the way that the daughters of Jethro described Moses. Moses allowed them to get the impression that he was Egyptian. Moses didn't necessarily tell them he was Egyptian, but he didn't protest their impression of him. Joseph, concludes the Medrash, embraced his land, and therefore he is interned there. Moshe didn't, and therefore he remained out of it. In other words, there is a deep connection between us and the land of Israel. Okay? It's interesting, I heard recently a wonderful debate between Jonathan Friedland. It was from a few years ago, I think, and one of the very clever Muslims, I can't remember his name, but Jonathan Friedland explaining how we see ourselves as inextricably bound to the land of Israel as Jews, and yet we are intensely British at the same time. He said that about the Jewish people in Israel, about the British Jews in Israel, he said, listen to these words, he said, we are the Anglo Jewry, when it looks at Israel, it sees its reflection in it. Now that fits precisely with what we are saying. I don't know whether Howard Jacobson was aware of this philosophical and mystic view, but that each and every Jew, secular and observant, is organically linked to the land of Israel. And therefore Israel for the Jew is not merely a nationality, it is the home of the Jewish inner consciousness. The Jewish soul is rooted in the energy vibrating in the land and atmosphere of Israel. So therefore, now we can understand the difference between a Moses and a Joseph. And there's no question Moses was the greatest that ever lived. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about in relation to the land of Israel, okay? And therefore, what we see is that Moshe, okay, he was referred to as an Egyptian from the land of Egypt, as being Egyptian, and he never corrected that mistake, that mistaken identity, that mistake in not identifying and saying to them, no, actually, I'm connected to the land of Israel. Joseph was always proclaimed and always ensured that people knew that he was a Hebrew from the Hebrew land. And therefore, Moshe, despite being the most outstanding leader and Jew that ever lived, did not Joseph, who maintained his relationship.
No, you're frozen.
His connection.
You froze, Rabbi. You froze.
Am I frozen?
You froze.
Oh dear.
Am I unfrozen? Have I unfrozen?
You're unfrozen.
Oh, no.
You're defrosted. No, I don't know.
I'm now defrosting rapidly.
I can hear you.
Yeah,
Can you see me now?
Yes,
One
yes,
yeah, we can see you now.
yes. Yes. Right. That's the start of anti-Semitism.
Okay. Yeah. So
No,
what we
To
are
say
saying is that the
something.
difference
we're not
between
having
Moses was
much
that
luck
Moses.
tonight.
1 minute. Let me move rooms. 1 second. Better now? Better?
Yes, okay.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Good,
Okay.
better, and best.
I'm sitting on the router, so I can't get any closer.
Oh, right,
But let me
okay.
share with you briefly, because obviously it's not gonna work. It's gonna go down. We said as follows: Moses and Joseph,
Joseph.
right? Were described and referred
Hello,
to
Estelle.
very differently.
I've come from YouTube. I've been watching it all on YouTube. I didn't know it was on Zoom.
Yeah,
We're outside again.
When
Where are
did
you
you
living?
go?
It's raining here. Where are you, Estelle? It's raining here. And you're outside.
No, that's a picture of my balcony. I've only just.
Oh,
I didn't know it was raining.
Okay, guys, we're just gonna finish this idea, and then
yes.
before I get cut off.
Yes.
So the idea we're saying, let's just try and absorb it. It's a really, really important idea. Why was Moses not buried in the land of Israel? Why didn't he merit, and why did Joseph merit? Okay, the answer, and you have to bear in mind, Joseph spent, his many years in the land of Egypt. Okay, many years in the land of Egypt when he could have returned to the land of Israel. But it's the way that they were associated, the way that they were connected. Moses was referred to by the daughters of Jethro as what? As an Egyptian, and he never corrected that misconception, that complete misrepresentation. The word Hebrew connects us to the land of Israel. That's where the word Ivri from the other side of the Jordan. Okay, and therefore Joseph will always, be it in prison, be it in the palace of Egypt, wherever he was in a foreign culture, he connected himself back to the land of Israel, and therefore he merited to be buried eventually in the land of Israel. And of course, we are blessed now, okay? To have the blessing of the land of Israel, a land flowing with milk and honey, a land which has achieved with a people so much. But I think sometimes that when we look at Israel, and of course now we have a new government, I think sometimes that one of the mistakes that we make as a nation is we forget that this is not like any other land. We're not like any other country. And we have to appreciate the unique nature of Israel and the bond that we have with the land, and not try to be in the land of Israel like every other nation.
Mm-hmm.
Our USP, our unique selling point is that we are connected to the land of Israel, that it is the Holy Land, the promised land, right? Every step you take, right, in the land of Israel, Abraham, Joshua, everyone walked up and down that country. We are so blessed, but we have to appreciate Israel not just as another land, not as a Uganda, but as a land where we have a close, inextricable bond. Our souls are bound up with the land of Israel. And please God, with that greater appreciation and sensitivity, then please God, we will see peace and only good things and prosperity and holiness and sanctity in the land of Israel. Amen. Okay.
If they start to behave themselves, Rabbi.
If who starts to behave themselves?
the members of the Knesset don't behave